see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
And Bridget, you wrote this book, Empathy and Education, Engagement, Values, and Achievement. And you're also a professor of education at the University of Sunderland in the UK. And since we already talked for about an hour, about your work, we wanted to kind of go into more depth in this discussion and talk about what you call profound empathy. And I'm assuming profound empathy is kind of like seeing that there's like a depth of empathy. You can have that empathy is not like a switch, like an on-off switch. Empathy is more like a dimmer switch, which you can kind of raise the empathy, right? Or maybe like levels, audio levels. You can kind of raise the sound level. And can you just explain, talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, actually. You can have sort of fundamental levels of empathy that you can use for just getting along with people in a very sort of normal, interactive way. But when you get to know somebody really well, as time passes, the levels of empathy deepen, and you become much more aware and much more in-depth knowledge of that person and what they like, what they don't like, their lives, their families. And all that brings a lot more to bear on the teacher-learner relationship and enables a lot more to happen. So I suppose what I would say is that we should be trying to find ways to find times to create profound empathy in interactions. And when you get to a more profound level, all sorts of things start to happen which don't on a superficial level. And in my analysis of empathy, there were lots of different areas that when teachers talked about empathy, they identified lots of different features of it, and they all got deeper and became more enhanced the deeper the quality of empathy is. And so it happens over time, really, I think. And it happens through one-to-one conversation.
Yeah,
Sorry.
So there's kind of like you're seeing kind of levels of empathy. Do you have like, well, here we have 0 and here's like 100%. And are you kind of like naming the different stages, or?
Well, I identified, I suppose 4 different types of empathy, which are in a sense different stages. But obviously I was looking at it specifically in terms of teaching and learning. So if you're just getting to know a class, for example, you might be using what I would call fundamental empathy. You're trying very hard to get to know them, but at this point you don't know them. And so you listen and you are very open and you accept students as they are. And that sets up the ground for creating a relationship. But that relationship develops over time and gets stronger and stronger with time. So I don't have a sort of 0 to 100, but it's not quite like that. But I think it can get deeper and deeper, and the deeper it is, the more effective it is for supporting other people and for learning, for supporting learning, and for developing self-esteem and for enabling values to develop and to raise achievement. And all those things get better the more opportunity you have for profound empathy. So I suppose you could go on and on. I don't suppose there is a limit, actually. I suppose a couple who live together for their whole lives and, really enjoy their lives together, I suppose that empathy just carries on deepening over time. So you could see it in terms of a relationship like that. But in classes, it's much more complex because you're not really dealing one-to-one. Very often in school you might have 30 pupils, so then you have a much lower level of empathy because you can't really get to know each individual as well as you would like. It's perhaps easier in a primary school, more complex in a secondary school where you might see 500 students. And because you see them for small amounts of time every week, or once a day, you don't really develop that same level of empathy that you would if you saw them more regularly or in smaller groups. So I think in school it's more problematic. And the other thing I did talk about as well is feigned empathy, which is quite an interesting concept, which is where a person in their interaction appears to be empathetic, but are actually pretending. And that's also, something that happens a lot. I mean, we all do it to a certain extent. We're working with colleagues, some colleagues will get along better with than others, and we're very, we have to be diplomatic and work with people, and that's a sort of feigned empathy in a way. It can be, I suppose, diplomacy at the nicer end is feigned empathy. But if you go into a relationship where you're pretending for your own gain, then that can be really quite unpleasant. And one could see it in all sorts of different situations. But at the worst end, it's the sort of empathy that a child abuser might use to really get to know a child and pretend to be their friend and pretend to like them and get on with them. And then later that all turns nasty when the relationship becomes one that is only for the abuser's end. So you can actually feign empathy, so at different levels, I think.
What would that look like, feigning empathy? Is that where you're kind of thinking one thing and doing another? I mean, what came to mind is my partner worked in a corporate kind of environment, and she would always say, I just don't like this person, but I try to be really nice.
Yes.
So you're not really talking about the deeper, conflicts or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think in all sorts of environments, we have to get along with each other just to work with each other. So we do feign it a little bit. But I think in relationships, sometimes even if you don't get on with somebody, sometimes if you have a bit more time with them and you learn a bit more about why they're like they are, that really helps to develop some empathy with them, even if you wouldn't instinctively get along with them. Sometimes just a little insight into their lives or their problems can really help you to develop empathy with them. But feigned empathy in its worst sense is when you're deliberately pretending to be having a good relationship when actually you haven't. And when you're really intent on hurting that other person, or really intent on doing something which will be to their disadvantage and to your advantage. So in a corporate world, of course, people do feign empathy quite a lot to make profit, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So they might, the classic one is the car salesman who is absolutely charming in all aspects towards you, but his main aim is to sell you a car, which, if he's just selling you a car that you want, that's fine. But if he tries to sell you something you don't want, then he's going into the feigned empathy, really, where he's pretending. And he knows that you don't want it, but he's still going to try and sell you it. So it's where in a sense, it's where you stop really respecting the other person.
Yeah.
And you're doing it for your gain rather than for their benefit.
Well, that story of the used car salesman comes up a lot around empathy. Yeah. It's like, someone can use empathy and take advantage of you. So there's this whole notion, but it's how to kind of respond to that is something I'm looking at. One person I interviewed, Simon Baron Cohen, he's British as well, and he talks about emotional empathy and kind of the cognitive empathy, the perspective taking, that someone who's like a psychopath can be very good at kind of this cognitive empathy, but they're not feeling what the consequences of their actions are on the other person. So he's saying that's not true empathy until you have both of those qualities.
Yes, and which does he say is the one that is the real empathy?
It's not that one is real, but that you need both to have kind of like true empathy.
Yeah.
That you're not really doing, you know, the like full empathy if you're just using cognitive empathy. That you have to actually feel what your actions are. So as the used car salesman is trying to sell you something that that you don't, that's maybe a lemon. I don't know if they use that term there, but you know, it's a junk car that's going to break down, and they know it, and but they just want to make the sale, make the money. That they're not thinking how you buying that car is going to be painful when the car breaks down. You're going to have all these bills to fix it.
Yeah, yeah. I, in a way, I think it's more complex than that. Even I don't think it's just separate, affective and cognitive. I think that what we know from neuroscience, and I suppose, you know, Simon Baron-Cohen is pretty much up on that. We know that emotion and cognition are interrelated all the time. They're not actually separate. They are. You know, when you think, you feel, and vice versa. I think what someone who uses feigned empathy can do, they can cut off that empathy at any point that it suits them. They can cut off their feeling. So I think I don't think they're without feeling altogether. I think they are able to have feeling, but they are they find it very easy to cut off that feeling and to ignore what people feel. So I don't think it's as straightforward as just affective and cognitive. I think they're interrelated, and I think certainly from everything I learned from the teachers that I was working with, they didn't separate affect and cognition. For them, it was all interrelated, and you know, they thought that when they were, let's say, for example, they found out something about a child, they would find out that the child had a phobia about maths, for example. Now that it's in a sense, it's a cognitive thing, but the cognition is all interrelated with the feeling. So they both felt what the child would feel, and they thought about what the child would feel in a more intellectual way. So I just think it's all a bit more complicated than separating things. And I think in education we've known for a long time that just separating the two is not necessarily as clear cut as that. I don't think it's as straightforward as that. But certainly in the history of empathy, the affect and cognition have always been separated. And in some models, you know, cognition is thought of more highly than affect. And in the moral, you know, in the moral sphere, when you look at the research into moral development, some people are really convinced that all you have to do is be able to think morally. They're not so bothered about feeling morally. So it's always been a bit of a debate, but I think over time, I think we have come. I think it is more interrelated than tends to be described. I mean, we all tend to describe things in order to try and pin it down for people, but I think sometimes the pinning down is not. It's not real. We do it. Yeah. We do it to try and explain things.
Yeah, the differentiations aren't that as big as they might seem. It's not like you go from this category to this category, but they're all more kind of interrelated in a.
That's right. Way. I mean, yeah, you're right. And when I looked into profound empathy, I found lots of different categories. But I say right at the start that these categories are just to help us understand things. Actually, very interrelated and overlapping, and people don't particularly understand them in those discrete categories because the human interactions are very complex and dynamic thing, and it's changing all the time as people are talking to each other and being with each other. So I think it's quite complex.
Would you like to go into those different components that you of profound empathy?
Yeah, in the book there's a diagram which sort of points out all the different areas that seem to be important in profound empathy.
Is this the one?
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll go through that just to explain it. When you analyse interviews, you start at the very lowest level and find lots of different categories, and then you build them up into bigger themes. And one of the big themes that came out was one called developing positive emotions and interactions, and this seemed to be, at the heart of empathy in teaching and learning. And lots of different areas within that. So the teachers took great pleasure in working with the children, and they felt that positive interaction that they had with them created happiness and pleasure for the child. It involved a lot of humour. Humour seems to be quite central to empathic relationships. They were able to see the good in all sorts of children, even a child who perhaps doesn't instinctively look or behave in a way that gives you positive feedback. They persevered with those children, and they found the good in them. They dug and dug till they found really nice things and built on those things the child could do or things the child was good at. And in the process of that, they sometimes had to mask their negative emotions. So if a child is behaving in a difficult way, the teacher doesn't automatically respond in the way that you might expect. They bypass that negative behaviour and find things that the child can behave positively about. So the teacher tends to hide their negative emotions and move on to something where they can find something positive.
So they're trying to look kind of deeper into what's going on for the child and kind of find the, you're saying positive. Do you have some kind of stories were you asking for actual narratives or about this?
Yes, they did explain examples for that. I mean, very often those examples are not to do with school. So if a child has got a lot of worries and anxieties around their schoolwork, the teacher might talk to them about something about home or something that they like outside of school, so that they can then build up a positive interaction around that topic. So it might be football, for example. They might be very interested in, soccer you would call it in America, I think. Mm-hmm. But in the UK, football is a very well-loved sport. It's our national sport. And a lot of children, even if you can't talk to them about their work, even if they're frightened of maths or they can't read, if you talk to them about the football, they'll talk about it and you'll start to build a positive interaction around it. And then quite a lot of teachers might even use the things they like football, to work on their literacy or to work on their maths and come at it through those topics. That was quite a common thing that people said.
So this is in the interaction, you're trying to find something that the child has a positive experience about.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to kind of empathize, trying to see that and kind of maybe reflect it back or something like that, and kind of build a relationship on that positive, kind of building on that positive emotion.
That's right, yes. Quite interestingly, I've just I have a PhD student who's just finished a PhD on, she was working with severely autistic children, and she found it very difficult to she was trying to help them develop their understanding of emotion by using a computer program. And she found it hard to get some of them even to look at the computer or be involved with the computer because they were quite severely autistic. But what she found was that if she just found out what they liked or what they were interested in and engaged with them with that initially, and then did the same thing on the computer, then she got them to the computer, got them interested, and then she was able to do the work on emotions with them to help them develop their emotions. So one little boy, for instance, loved drawing, and so he drew on paper. So what she did was she got hold of a tablet computer that you can draw on with a pen. And so he started drawing on the computer, and then she was able to get him interested in the computer and able then to go on to use the program of emotions. And had a lot of success by doing exactly that. And in education we do that a lot. We try and work from children's interests, but it seems to be particularly important if a child's got difficulties. So yeah, positive emotion. They gave a lot of time to children who needed it. That was one of the other. And in order to develop the positive emotion, you've got to do it through time, over time. And they gave those children very individual attention. Even if they were a class teacher, they'd find a little time somewhere in a corridor or in an entrance or exit to lesson to take a little time with that child and get to know them a bit better. Quite a lot of children needed some physical contact, you know, and I don't know how it is in the USA, but we've had a lot of problems in the UK in schools because of you know, issues of child abuse. Teachers have been very reluctant to you know, have physical contact with children, to hold them or to cuddle them and so on. But it certainly became an issue in this, that teachers said very often children do need that physical contact, and it really helps if you can, you know, even just a hand on the shoulder or a pat on the back, something to show that you as a person genuinely care for them.
I could just add, you know, on our Empathy Center Facebook page, I just did a post today of an article about oxytocin.
Oh, yes.
And
yeah.
they were just talking, in the article it talks about touch, you know, different ways of raising the level of oxytocin. And it says it's during hugs, snuggling, holding hands, partner dance, massage, body work, and prayer.
Yeah.
So those are just some, and birth, you know, breastfeeding and so forth.
Right.
And so that's really, when you talk about the physical touch, there's that releases oxytocin. So, and that's kind of like a hormone or a neuropeptide that actually kind of calms us and makes us more relaxed.
Yes, yeah, it does, and it's associated. It's a sort of symbolic thing as well for people, isn't it? It's quite a symbolic gesture that means you're close enough to somebody as well. You know, if somebody who we don't know puts their hand on our shoulder, we might be a bit wary or a bit unsure, and I don't think it would have the same effect. So it depends who it is and the context that it happens in, I think. You know, I mean, for children who've had physical abuse, sometimes they really do not want physical contact because it's associated with negative emotion. And so I think it depends on the context a little bit, but it's certainly something that is important usually for most people, I would say. And that comfortable, making you feel comfortable for learning definitely is a key factor for helping people learn. They've got to feel reasonably relaxed and comfortable to learn. If it's all pressure, it makes it much harder, I think. In fact, I've just started a new research project recently, and I was interviewing some children this week, and they all said the same things. You know, that they like to feel happy, they like to feel comfortable in a classroom, they like to feel that the teacher's going to help them, not just shout at them, and will understand all their needs. and focus on their individual needs. So, you know, the children say the same thing really as the teachers in this respect. The other thing that was quite important that, well, if I go through, shall I go through these different areas?
You had the 8, right? How many?
Yeah, there was seven different areas. Yeah. The other thing that these teachers were very good at was understanding themselves and understanding their interactions with others, and they explained those. They opened them up and explained those understandings. And these children felt they liked teachers who explain things and explain why things happen. And these teachers really like to relate to children as their normal selves, not just as a teacher. They like to relate them as one human being to another, and that also seemed very important. It's very easy when you're in classrooms to become a sort of stereotype of a teacher who manages and bosses and gets everybody organised, but both children and teachers like a teacher who's not like a teacher. So that's quite an interesting thing in itself. And when you're able to explain things and talk and understand your own feelings and understand other people's feelings, you get to a much deeper level of interaction with them, and there's less pretense and less superficiality, I suppose. So understanding each other was really important. They were very good at being aware of all the relationships in a child's life, these teachers. So they didn't just, they weren't just interested in the relationship between them and the child. They knew how they got on with all the other people in their lives, whether those relationships were good or bad. And, some teachers would say things like, well, I knew which lesson he'd come from by the way he walked in the door. Because they knew that that a child, for example, had a bad lesson with another teacher, and that when they come into their classroom, they're in a sort of frame of mind of a not very good frame of mind to work, and they can tell by their body language and the way they look that what's gone on previously wasn't very nice or wasn't very helpful to them. So there's this whole idea of understanding the relationships that are happening beyond the classroom. So at home, with peers in the playground, with other staff in lessons. And all that seemed also very, very important to developing profound empathy. So they're creating this mental picture of the other person that's really detailed, really extensive. And it's not just about feeling it, it's about understanding the sort of the problems they have in all different environments. So that's appreciation of all relationships. The other thing about these teachers was that they had great breadth of empathy as well as depth of empathy. So they were able to empathise with all different children. And sometimes in classrooms you can see teachers get on really well with certain groups of children, but maybe not so with others. But these teachers felt it was their job and their responsibility to actually work with every child in the class, whether they were, whatever their issues were, whatever their problems were. And this was an interesting bit actually. They all found different children more difficult or easier to empathise with. And they all had different opinions on that, because it was very much to do with their own lives and their own upbringing. And some children were easier to form a relationship with and others were harder, but that didn't stop them forming relationships with all children. They kept on working at it. And part of this was that their main aim was to meet children's needs. So whatever their needs were, the teacher's job was to meet those needs. And it might be academic, it might be social, it might be emotional. And that their role was to find out what every child needed and to then put into plans some action which would meet those needs.
And what sort of needs are there? What are you seeing? Like if
Well, it depended on particular children. I mean, for instance, some children are so frightened of doing maths that they burst into tears when it's mentioned in a classroom. Some children have found it so difficult to learn to read that reading has become something that they avoid at every opportunity, and put up tremendous defences around themselves to stop them having to do reading. For some children, it may be that they're very, very sad for some reason, for something that's happened at home or something that's happened at school. And the teacher's job is to try and get to understand a little bit of why they're so sad, and to lift their spirits and help them through that. Or to identify the need which may need an expert. So sometimes the teacher can meet that need, another time the teacher knows that their job is to find the expert who can meet that need. And they were very clear about that they knew their own limitations as well, and that they, as soon as they found they'd reached the extent of what they could do, they would refer the child to somebody who had more expertise.
So reading the need is like reading the emotion, because you're seeing, oh, someone is feeling fear, and they're needing kind of security or reassurance, or they're feeling sad, they need support or someone to listen to them or something like that.
Yes, they were very good at reading all the signs. To the extent that they even said, well, sometimes we realise that they're not saying something, and that is the thing that is most worrying them, or they're not mentioning their dad, for example. If they always used to mention their dad and suddenly they don't mention their dad, well, it could be that dad has disappeared, is off the scene, he could be ill, all sorts of things happen in everybody's lives that the teacher tries to identify and then work on, because basically they knew that if the child is really not happy in some way, then they can't learn very well. They've got to be reasonably comfortable and happy to learn and to make progress. So their job was really to find out the problem and sort it out, in a sense, so that the child could then move on in their learning.
Well, this is sounding like teaching is so much more than just feeding the information. It's like you're needing to read the whole emotional landscape of what's going on and be able to address it and respond to it.
Yes, and the really good teachers, that's what they do. They do that all the time. And the classroom's dynamic. The emotions are changing all the time as well within a classroom. I mean, it's not a set thing. So, even external events can really change the emotional landscape of a classroom, and a teacher has to be able to adapt to that and react to that, and use all the different skills at their command to be able to make a lesson work. And that was one of the other areas that, in profound empathy, the teachers explained that they were incredibly adaptive, that they adapted to all different situations. So the way they would be one-to-one would be very different to the way they'd be with a class. The way they'd be with a class who had got low self-esteem, or a lot of children with low self-esteem, would be very different to the way they would be with children who had a lot of confidence. And so there's like groups and there's individuals within those groups, and even groups within the groups. So yeah, it's a very complicated process, and teachers are really highly skilled individuals. And as well as doing all that, they're also trying to, work through a curriculum which often is very packed and very busy, and there's exams and assessments, and all that makes it a real tough job. And until you've done it, you don't realise how tough it is, I think. To do it well, anyway.
Yeah.
It's hard.
With empathy. To do it well with empathy.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And with empathy for everyone that you interact with, that's a challenge. Anyway, what these children, these teachers said, that as you got to know somebody better and you formed a really strong empathic relationship, it meant then that you begin to care very strongly about each individual that you work with. And that leads you to want to take responsibility for them. So that if there is a problem, or if there are issues that need dealing with, or just even if a child's a normal child, you want the very best for them, and you're trying always to take them on to improve their lives, to improve their learning, and improve the way they feel about themselves, so that they make the best of their own potential, really. So teachers got very strong. These empathic teachers have a very strong sense of responsibility for every child that they worked with, which meant, they often lie awake at night worrying about children and trying to think over their lessons and what they could do to help them more, and, new strategies for helping them and so on. So they did tend to take their worries home at night, which is one of the downsides, I think, of empathy. Mm-hmm. It causes you sleepless nights. And they had a very strong desire to protect the children, to look after them, and to really understand them more deeply in order to do their very best for them.
So there's something about when you empathize with someone, you start feeling and connecting more deeply, is that this sense of care arises, that you want kind of the well-being because you're feeling the pains or the joys or the suffering or the whole spectrum, that it becomes part of your life, and you're wanting kind of the well-being. And that's where the sense of responsibility comes in, I guess, where...
It does, yes, because you're so close to them and you're feeling what they're feeling and you want the best for them. And you try to, fill them with ambition and aspiration and ideas of what they can do with themselves and their lives. And I think, that is when it becomes very much a moral profession, really, or a moral interaction. And so you're modelling all the time great care and it's love, really, I suppose, at the end of the day, for each individual, with the hope that they really do their best for themselves. And I think it's that at that point that empathy really becomes a moral driver. And as you model it, you also get those responses. So what teachers said was that, if I model care and I show that in every way I'm trying my best to do my best for that child, then the children respond. And the quality of the relationships is really high then, because, I don't know if I gave this example before when I touched, but one little boy he was really disturbed and in lots of ways had a terrible home life. But, when the teacher was off ill, he asked how she was and asked if, if she was getting better and things like that, because it's not the sort of thing he would do normally. But because she'd formed a really strong bond with him, he was starting to have deep feelings for her as well. And you build that trust and that respect, and the trust is really important to learning as well, because you can't really take those leaps into learning if you don't trust the person you're working with. Because learning's quite scary. It's something new, it's something you don't know and you've maybe not done before. So you've got to have this very trusting relationship in which the person is not going to tell you off for getting it wrong. Who's going to encourage you to try to do new things. And so it's all bound up in the caring, and the trust is all bound up in the teacher-student relationship, and is bound up with learning. And again, they're not separate things. They're all interacting dynamically all the time. So it's not about, telling a child the, I suppose, moral rules. It's about modelling care. And explaining care in the same way that you would explain any other aspect of learning. and showing that you really do want that child to achieve, and you know, to treat the other children that they're with in a kind and supportive and facilitative way. And the thing is, if you can have a teacher who's able to do this with all the children in the class, actually the children learn to do it for each other. And that's when you really get high quality relationships and atmospheres in classes where the teacher it has succeeded in making every child feel cared for, feel looked after and secure. And then that the children reciprocate and they interact in that sort of way. So it multiplies itself in a way. It doesn't just, you know, it's not just what you do with one child. It multiplies itself between people. The more that a child understands how to act and behave in an empathic way, then they affect others all the time.
Yeah, so as a teacher is modeling it, the students, children are picking up that way of being, and then they're starting to relate to each other with that, and
Yes.
Then you create that culture of empathy, which is what I kind of call it, is how do you create a whole environment where it's the empathy is supported.
Yes, and it is that is how you get a culture of empathy. But I think it's a lot harder to do when you've got a lot of constraints around you. So these teachers were very good at that, but nevertheless they would argue that they didn't have enough time with children, that they needed more time with children, more time with individuals, and it's always the most damaged children, or the children who struggle most, that need that extra time and development. And teachers know that and would love to have more time with children.
So you need a lot of time for that. You know, my partner is a teacher as well. She's a nurse, but she always tells the story of having, you know, when she first kind of graduated and was starting to teach. And I think it was New York, and it was in the ghetto, and it was in an African American, you know, kind of community. A lot of students were African Americans, and there was one student who was kind of a real, you know, kind of caused a lot of trouble, but she was, you know, very patient. I think she was very empathic as well. And then at the end of the year, you know, she was leaving. It was like, you know, the last day of school. He came up and like really thanked her, and you know, and she still remembers that. You know, it's like it almost brings her to tears that, you know, this was some way that she'd really kind of connected with this student, and that the relationship, you know, had been supportive for him, and you know, positive for him as well, to the point where he was coming up and, you know, thanking her.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, and it's always those that have been the most difficult that are the most keen to thank you later for the the time that you gave them, you know, because they know they've struggled and they know they've had problems, and they've often had people who have not taken an interest and haven't had that patience and haven't made an effort to get to know them and support them and so on. And so they are usually, yeah, very, very, very grateful for that. Not that they should necessarily be grateful. I think it's a pity that somebody somewhere beforehand didn't have the opportunity to give them the time they needed. But I do think it can change people quite radically. And, you know, what you find is that children who do get a bit of time do change quite radically. So we need to be finding that time for them. And sometimes the classroom's not a good enough place, I think. It's too busy, it's got too many constraints, too much emphasis on exams and testing and all this sort of thing, and not enough on meeting individual needs.
So, and to do that, to meet the individual needs, it's going to take time. So that's kind of like one of the barriers to creating this culture of empathy, is if there's a lack of time. That it takes time, and we need to you know, set that time aside for that.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's not everything that's a sort of a quite complex skill, and it needs time. I mean, if you want to learn to read, that needs time. And some children have parents who give them lots of time to develop the reading, and some don't. And so when they come into schools, we need to find that time to develop the reading. And for children who have had not much empathy or support or care, they need time from people who can care. And all these issues are interwoven all the time. And we sometimes focus on the academic when really it's the emotional that needs developing, I suppose, in schools.
Yeah. Well, you had some more. Did you gone through all 7 of those, or?
Yeah, I think I've gone through most of them. I'll just have a look. Yeah, I think one of the in the section 6 on the adaptive teacher, it's probably quite important as well to say that these teachers could adapt to any situation and to any different person and to any different environment. And what that meant was that they got to grips very quickly with what was needed in any particular situation. And although we talk a lot in schools about high expectations and that we should always have high expectations for children, well, we should. But we also have to start with realistic expectations, because if we set the bar too high, we can just increase low self-esteem and failure, and that doesn't help. So although these teachers did have high expectations, they always started in the right place. And to do that, you have to know the child really well, where to start. And sometimes that means really digging quite deeply into their past to find out where they start, where they need to start, whether it's in emotionally or whether it's to do with their work, their literacy or their numeracy. And so they worked really hard to find the right place, and then they could build up. And the other thing that they said was that they couldn't really have high expectations and be critical until they built that trust and that care. Once you've built up a trusting relationship, then you can be really much more constructively critical about somebody and really push them hard. But you can't push them hard without that relationship. So expectations are built on those relationships, really.
Well, the thing with expectations, isn't it kind of like it's like a goal you're setting, and there's a whole question about what are the goals. Is the goal to memorize as much facts, or is it the expectations to create empathic skills? Right? It's like the society can put these different expectations out there and say, well, we need to have high achievement, but it's high achievement towards what and why? And I would say that the empathy, creating an empathic environment in itself, should be one of the goals for this achievement.
Yes, well, it should be, yes. But unfortunately, because we insist on putting so many children in one class, that makes it much more difficult to do that. Because instead of the teacher and the children having an equal relationship, which is what's needed in an empathic environment, you have to have a much more mutually respectful relationship. That's much harder if you've got one teacher and 30 children. Because inevitably the teacher has to be in charge and has to manage the class. And managing a class and, keeping them working through curriculum actually doesn't always allow enough time for the relationship building and the trust to build. So, one of the problems we have in education is that we treat children it's more like running a factory very often than a school. And if you want those sort of high quality relationships, you've got to change the way we do it a little bit, I think. And as you say, if that's one of your aims, if you want children to grow up with an ability to empathise with others and to get along in the world with everybody else, then you've got to think about the environment you create in which that can happen. If you treat people very sort of discourteously and short and shout and all that sort of thing, then you actually, they're not learning anything like that. But if we insist on putting students in big, huge groups with masses of diversity, in which the teacher's task almost becomes impossible to manage learning in that environment, then the children just feel, well, this isn't really doing me any good, and it isn't. So we've got to really think about how you create the conditions for that intensive interaction which is needed.
So your book and your study, kind of, what was it? Was it just kind of looking at the relationship of empathy within the classroom, or were you coming up with a series of policy suggestions as well?
That actual study was really more about understanding what empathy is and how it works in classrooms. One of the things that did come out from it was all the benefits of creating an empathic classroom. So, it does raise self-esteem, it does create trust, it does support the better quality learning, it does support assessment, naturally, because you're interacting in a way that helps learning and understanding. So it did all those things, but the big conclusion you have to come to, because I watched people working one-to-one, small groups and classes, the highest quality learning and the best quality relationships were actually in the one-to-one and small classes. So your biggest, outcome for policy would be to reduce class sizes, really, and to make sure that children who really need a lot of one-to-one, are desperate for one-to-one, that they're given it at a very early stage in life. And we do have, we have policies that try and do that from time to time, but inevitably when they get a recession, they disappear.
Yeah.
So we know that one-to-one supports reading, supports maths, supports emotional development, social development, but it's expensive. And so, when there's money around, we get a lot of projects to support children, and then when the money disappears, they're pulled away again. But in some countries, for example, in Scandinavia, they have a lot smaller class sizes, and they reap the benefits, both educationally and socially and emotionally. So we do know these things work. It's whether we've got the will to pay for them, I suppose.
Yeah, and your work is creating the rationale for doing it. I think as we explain how empathy works, the benefits of empathy, it gives something to policymakers to consider in creating the policies. There was one other thing that I wanted to look at was self-esteem. You've mentioned in your book, and you've talked about it. And there is a researcher at the University of Texas, Kristen Neff, who has written about self-compassion. And she's kind of talked about well, in the United States, we've had a whole movement around self-esteem. I don't know, it's 10, 20 or more years that it's been kind of pushed in the schools. And it's kind of come up to its limits. And she has a few kind of criticisms about that self-esteem movement. And it's basically, I think she says here, the main problem is that having high self-esteem requires feeling special and above average. To be called average is considered an insult in our culture. And the thing with self-esteem is that it's based on kind of self-evaluation or evaluation by others. So it has a kind of a judgment, evaluative quality to it. And she was calling for self-compassion, which I would call self-empathy, which is, it's kind of that, instead of being evaluative and maybe self-judgmental or being judged by others, it's kind of like there's something more about kind of the connection you know, it's like a sense of connection, where we're not comparing ourselves with each other. It's more about kind of connecting with each other or connecting with ourselves in kind of a non-judgmental way. And then she goes into explaining all the benefits of self-compassion or self-empathy. So I was wondering what you think about that discussion.
Yeah, well, I see what she means. I think the main problem we've got with in schools with self-empathy or self-compassion or self-esteem actually is that one of the problems you have is that you put children in year groups and you test them in year groups and you give them norms for that year group. So actually they do feel their self-esteem drops dramatically if they come into the, you know, the lower section of that year group. So that's another reason, a problem for having, when you have large classes, is that a child is always being told where they fall in the scheme of things, and whether they are good or bad, or and that doesn't really help the students who are at the top end either, because they have a sort of inflated sense of self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Whereas the students, you know, in the lower end have a low self-esteem, and also self-esteem is not just one thing. I mean, you have very different feelings about yourself in different areas, don't you? I mean, so you might consider yourself to be a fantastic artist but hopeless at maths, or you might consider yourself to be, you know, really good at reading but maybe not so good at writing. And so self-esteem is something that you have in all those different areas. But I agree with what you're saying about self-compassion. The thing is not to feel bad, be made to feel bad about anything that you are, you know, you don't think you are good at. But it's always a problem when you're always compared to a year group of people. Mm-hmm. It's a real problem in schools. So that normative evaluation is the thing that makes you feel, makes you hard on yourself.
Yeah, getting the bad grades or how you compare to others. So that sense of comparing and judgment.
Yes. Uh-huh. And it's when you've got normative assessment that happens, and we've known that for a long time. The effect of schooling on children who don't succeed so well in school is dramatic. And then you know they're in that position, and then they're not only in that position, they're often maybe, you know, the effect of people who live in areas of social deprivation has a massive effect on their self-esteem. And there's been a lot of work done on that in Glasgow, for example, on the effect of, you know, struggling. If you're struggling along in life with all sorts of problems of, you know, housing and you know, not much money and not a very interesting job, all those things affect your self-esteem. So we have to really think about the whole thing. I mean, it's not just education, it is the whole way of, you know, of the way society works. If we ensure that some people are always really having a hard time, then it'll be very hard for them to be, to feel good about mm-hmm. themselves. So it's a much bigger thing than just education. I mean, it is the whole social and economic structure of society.
But I think the work she's doing is to she wants to replace the notion of self-esteem, because it's kind of evaluative with yes. With empathy and compassion, which is, I'm not quite sure what the word is that I'm looking for here. Is I guess it's like being not judgmental, negative or positive, saying I'm terrific, and she says there's this epidemic here in the United States of narcissism, because we all have to be great and wonderful. I'm great and wonderful, or you know, the flip side, which is you know, you know, feeling kind of terrible about yourself. So it's like is like, is there another way of doing it that's kind of based on empathy? That empathy is kind of like the antidote or a different approach to that worldview, that way of being, and kind of a highly judgmental. I guess the empathy is kind of like accepting everyone for who they are, and it's like this, just accepting. It doesn't matter if you're this or that on the scale. It's just it's giving worth to everyone's feelings and needs and emotions and being, maybe.
Yes, and ensuring that they don't, not making them worry about anything that they're not particularly wonderful at. So it's about removing anxiety in that sense, and not getting really upset if you feel you're not brilliant at maths or whatever. I mean, because we need lots of different people in the world with lots of different skills, and I suppose that is at the end of the day, it would be a very sad world if we were all the same and all wonderful at the same thing. So.
Well, in this discussion, we had wanted to go over profound empathy, and we went through the 7 different kind of areas, components, I think, that you'd kind of looked at in profound empathy. Is there something else you'd like to say that you feel you'd like to cover around profound empathy?
Well, I'll just about some of the effects of it.
Okay.
Which I think is quite important. One of the things that the teachers said was that because when they were able to be empathic, it opened up conversation. So it built a child's ability to talk and to communicate. And of course, that's essential for all sorts of things, but obviously for learning, it's really important. And they didn't just talk about schoolwork. They exchanged personal conversation. So very often the teacher would say a little bit about their life or their children, or what they like doing, and so on, and the child exchanged that. And it seems to me that personal exchange was very important for establishing trust and for establishing a much more human interaction rather than a teacher-pupil interaction. And although, I mean, you obviously got this this person who's concerned about esteem, but one of the problems we have in schools is that some children have just incredibly low self-esteem, and it seems to me that they don't feel valued. They don't feel as if they've got skills that as a person anybody's really bothered about them or cares about them. So that is the area in which empathy really does support them and makes them feel they're okay. That the way they are and the things they can do is fine. It's not a problem. But actually, by doing that, you enable them to develop quite substantially and to go on to learn. I mean, basically, because when we've got low self-esteem, we sort of tend to defend ourselves all the time. We turn into this little hedgehog type person with spikes on the outside, and we just defend all the time instead of finding out, trying things, being adventurous. So I think it did seem to make a lot of difference to some children. The ability to make emotional links with children seemed very important. Children do, if you talk to kids, the kids I was talking to this week, well, they just want to be happy in the lessons. They just want to feel okay. They want to feel that they're coming in and there's no threats, there's no major problems. And so that emotional link a teacher makes with a child, and when they spot the emotions and can respond to those, seems to be very important in learning. When empathy is sort of strongly developed over time, it had more powerful effects. And then it really starts to transform learning and relationships. So when you have a chance to work with a child intensively one-to-one, you can turn them from a child who thinks they are worthless and inept and incapable into a child who really has a feeling that they're an important and valued person, and then they become able to learn. And it doesn't take a lot, actually, to really develop learning and to make a child feel much better about themselves and much more, proactive. And to treat other people well as well. So that's, that whole transformation happens if you can have what I'd call consolidated empathy, where over time you've really been able to work with a child and really develop them. And that's, frequently teachers talked about it transforming the way the child was, the way they looked, the way they behaved, and the way they learned. So it is a very, very powerful quality, empathy, which makes a lot of difference if you really get a chance to use it well. And for the teachers themselves, I think it had quite powerful effects on students. But for teachers, what it seemed to mean as a teacher, they were able to get the best out of their students. They learnt continuously about their students because they were always finding out about each individual and what made them tick, basically. And so the teachers were very good learners. So in a sense, empathy's got something to do with learning generally. It seems to enable you to learn, I would say. And it affected the whole way they were in classes and with children. So it affected everything they did the way they described it was it affected everything from the way you come into the lesson in the morning to the way you leave the lesson in the evening, because you're focusing on individuals and trying to support and extend individuals. So they would actually, it's the way you smile at them. If you've got empathy, it affects the way you smile at them, the way you talk to children. It affects how you are with them if you meet them in the supermarket on a Saturday or Sunday. It affects the whole way the teacher is with both their children and other people, I suppose, as well. So it's a very, very powerful quality, and definitely has a very powerful effect on learning as well as effect on behaviour and interaction. So I suppose that's what I did want to just explain, that it is not, we ignore it at our peril, really. We need to provide the conditions to allow it to flourish. I think we'd have a better society if we did that.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think you do.
That's why I'm doing.
Converted.
What's that?
I think I'm preaching to the converted.
Yeah,
here.
but we're preaching to the people out there too. That's why I'm so grateful for you taking the time to share your insights and about this and all your hard work of having put this together. And are you going to be continuing to focus on empathy in your work? Is this kind of your area of focus now?
Well, it is, but although it's probably my central focus, I also do lots of other things, and I'm interested in a whole range of things. But funnily enough, whatever you actually delve into, you find that empathy plays quite an important part in it. Now, whether that's just the way I think about it, but it seems to me that whatever you're looking at, you start to see that and how it could change. So, for example, I'm quite interested in design and in ICT. And, if you look at the way people design things, empathy is really crucial to design. If you look at how you set up a classroom, if you put a lot of IT into it, the way that you set it up makes a big difference to the quality of empathy in a classroom. And ICT, I think, in lots of ways, is very powerful and mimics a lot of the qualities of empathy that you know I've been investigating.
And what is ICT? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah. Well, information communication technology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what we call it in the UK. So, I mean, you know, technology it should actually be able to really support empathy. But sometimes the way we design it and the way we implement it doesn't help as much as it could.
Well, I did see some program about Khan Academy. It's a person who did online training for math, and then they're implementing it into the schools now. And what they find is it's shifted the kind of the structure of the classroom, where a lot of the homework that's kind of done on your own can be done through video in this online training at home. And then at the school, when the students are working on it, that the teacher can see where the problems are and can really go in and give one-on-one assistance. So it's using the technology to take some of the parts that the students can do on their own, and then creating more space for that one-on-one interaction that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, well, that is the one really good thing about technology. It does facilitate one-on-one in all sorts of different ways. Whether you put it in a classroom, it changes the relationships, because the teacher, instead of being at the front and controlling the class, tends to come round and speak to individuals more and works with them side by side. And also the computer can replace a lot of the things that the teacher can do. Not in a human sense, but it can support one-to-one interaction, and it can have different levels in it, and it can support children's progress, which, as you say, then allows the teacher time, to do that really deep stuff and to go to the things which maybe the computer will never be able to do. But it also allows time for the human relationship to develop.
Well, yeah, I'm really glad about this internet and Skype, that this is an example of that, that here we are. I mean, I'm in California, you're in the UK, we're able to have this dialogue. So I'm really love technology, and really trying to see how we can have, use this for empathy, especially the video part, the texting, like where I'm just writing. I don't have the same empathic connection that I do when I'm able to see you, see your body movements and all that. So this is like another level, which I really enjoy.
It is. And I think that's, certainly in some of my other research into ICT, is that the closer that you can get to the real human experience online, the better. So the more you can see the person, hear the person, and get a sense of who they are, makes a lot of difference, I think, to the quality of interaction. And I think now we're getting to that point where it is pretty good. If you went back 5 years, it was, there was all sorts of problems. But now I think it's getting to the point where you can have a proper conversation with somebody at a distance, which is lovely, really.
Well, Well, we've gone for about an hour and 15 minutes, so I feel like we could talk for hours about this, and I really enjoy our conversation and learning about your research. And I'd be glad to, continue with, maybe some panel discussions, or if you're wanting to do another section on another component of your research, would love to do that. So.
Yes, well, I've started contacting people about a panel, so I think I haven't had any responses yet, but I hope to in the next couple of weeks to have got a panel together, which would be really nice. I thought it'd be quite nice to have. I don't know if you've interviewed any teachers of early years learning, nursery school. because it seems to me it's really important at that level as well. And so I've got a couple of people who might be interested in talking about that.
Oh, great.
And I've contacted a friend who's always been interested in empathy, but it's whether they've got Skype or not. So I'm trying to find out if they've got the Skype and if they need to use it.
Yeah.
But it works pretty well. I do think it works quite well.
Well, good, and that sounds like our next step there, our next action, our next empathic action to do. So
Yeah.
then, well, thank you very much for being part of this. Very grateful, and look forward to our next step in building a culture of empathy worldwide.
Yeah. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Edwin. Lovely to talk to you.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.